Starting with the words "you're fired" during his apprentice days, Donald Trump has had some memorable phrases over the years. But as he transitioned from real estate mogul and reality star to political candidate and president, Mr. Trump seems to have developed a habit of looking to history for memorable phrases. CBSNews.com political editor Will Rahn took a look at the historical roots of Mr. Trump's favorite sayings, and he joins me now from Washington. All right, Will, so this week, Arizona's Republican senators John McCain and Jeff Flake both called out the president for criticizing the media. Early in his presidency, Mr. Trump called the press, quote, "the enemy of the American people." Can you explain the historical roots of that phrase?
Well, I think it raised a lot of eyebrows at the time because we associate it with dictators, frankly. Maximilien Robespierre, who led the Great Terror after the French Revolution, said that he wished nothing but death to the enemies of the people. Joseph Stalin used it with such frequency that Nikita Khrushchev, when he took over, he said that the phrase could no longer be used. Lenin used it. Mao used it. We don't know if the president was aware of the context when he sent that tweet, I think in February 2017, denigrating the press. But people with historical consciousness, I would include Senator Flake in that description, they noticed the parallels and they didn't like it. And now Senator Flake has gone to the Senate floor and he's called out the president for it.
Well, on the campaign trail, the president spoke of the silent majority, a phrase more closely associated with another president. Let's go ahead and play a bit of sound.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support.
The silent majority is back, and we're going to take the country back. The silent majority, believe me, is back. And I think we can use it somewhat differently. I don't think we have to call it a silent majority anymore because they're not silent.
So, Will, who makes up the silent majority?
Well, so when Richard Nixon first made that speech, it was November 1969. It was after the largest anti-war protest in American history, a protest against the Vietnam War. And what President Nixon was saying was that the vast majority of the American public agrees with me. That's an idea that Donald Trump trumpeted throughout the 2016 campaign. It's something that he's latched onto. And interestingly, they do have similar coalitions in terms of a mix of working class, otherwise Democratic voters, particularly white working class Democratic voters, and traditional Republican voters. Roger Stone, who worked for both men, noticed that parallel. He said, listen, this is the same coalition. This is the same group that both people are going after. Really, what you're trying to say with a statement like that is that while my critics are very noisy, you see them everywhere, you see them on television, you see them in the newspapers, the vast majority of the American people believe in me and agree with me.
Well, in another Nixon parallel, President Trump referred to himself as the, quote, law and order candidate. Now, critics have said that that phrase had racist undertones. Can you explain that?
Well, you got to look at the context a little bit. So when Richard Nixon is running in 1968, America's a pretty violent place. That's the year that you saw the assassination of Martin Luther King. You saw the assassination of Robert Kennedy. You have huge riots. You have Chicago shut down by a massive anti-war riot during the 1968 Democratic Convention. The country appears to be coming apart at the seams in some ways over civil rights and over the Vietnam War. Now, when President Trump runs in 2016, what you have is a much safer America. Crime rates are much lower. But still, he ran as the law and order candidate, and it's a message that resonated, I think, because on television screens, even though America is a much safer place than it was in the late 1960s in many ways, particularly in the big cities, you still had riots taking place. You had riots coming back in places like Baltimore and places like Ferguson, Missouri. He would talk a lot about the drug crisis in this country that was reverberating throughout the heartland with the opioid crisis. He talked about the porous southern border and the need for more border security, the need for a wall to stop criminal gangs from coming up from Mexico. So this is a message, obviously, that played well. It helped President Trump win the Electoral College. At the same time, critics will point out that there are clear racial undertones to it. It's something that, in the minds of critics at least, plays to the anxiety of white voters, those white working class voters that are part of the coalitions of both men who are worried about the other, who are worried about immigrant crime, who are worried about crimes committed by minorities, whether they're based in fact or not. That is, I think, what critics have latched on to, and that's something that's going to stick with the president as long as he uses inflammatory language about people from other countries.
Finally, Will, I want to talk about the president's signature slogan, America First.
Right.
You write that the phrase, quote, hasn't aged well since it was first used ahead of World War II. What connotations does that phrase have now?
Right. And a lot of people noted this during the 2016 campaign. So America First, well, it started off, actually, it was a campaign slogan of Woodrow Wilson in 1916 when he was running to keep the United States out of World War I. However, it's really most associated with the anti-war movement in the United States before World War II, which in some cases was overtly sympathetic to Hitler. Charles Lindbergh's, who was perhaps the most famous man in the country at the time, next to Franklin Roosevelt, his career never really recovered from being a leader of the America First movement. And also for really kind of playing, openly flirting with anti-Semitism and saying good things about Hitler's Air Force, the strength of Germany at the time. It's been defended, really interestingly, by Pat Buchanan in recent years. He wrote a book arguing that World War II was essentially unnecessary, that we didn't need to get into it. And Pat Buchanan is also the man who coined the silent majority phrase for Richard Nixon. And Pat Buchanan's also defended Donald Trump. America First may have bad connotations, bad historical echoes to it, but to hear the president say it, to hear his defenders say it, like Mr. Buchanan, what you have is you're saying, listen, we're not going to be isolationist, we're not retreating from the world stage. At the same time, the priority of the United States government is to look after U.S. citizens. It's to look after Americans first.
All right, Will Rahn in Washington. Will, thanks very much.
Thank you.